Hello, and welcome to the second lecture on functional level strategies. Before we get into the lecture, a few housekeeping things. As a reminder, Quiz 6 is due Friday, February 22nd at 5 p.m. Also, want to remind folks that a week from Thursday, we're going to have our first exam. It's going to be a take-home exam that you will take on as you learn. So it'll be posted. There's a module at the very bottom of the page below the cases, and there you'll find a link in which you'll take the exam. The exam is going to open at 9 a.m. on Thursday, February 28th. You will have until 11:55 p.m. on Thursday to complete the exam. But once you start the exam, you'll have 75 minutes to complete the exam. So you'll want to make sure that you have about an hour and a half or so set aside for you to take the exam at some point on Thursday, February 28th. But you can take it at any time between 9 a.m. and 11:55 p.m. And 11:55 p.m. is when it closes, so you'll actually want to start the exam an hour and 15 minutes or an hour and a half before that. The exam is going to include 40 multiple choice true-false questions. Those are going to be very similar to the kinds of questions that you've been seeing on your weekly quizzes. Actually, they're going to be pulled from the same question bank that the quizzes are, so there may be a chance that some of the quiz questions that you've had you'll see again on the exam. But everyone will have different multiple choice questions. There'll also be 5 short answer essay questions. And my plan is to kind of give you guys some examples of what those might look like on the study guide that I'll work on this weekend, and give you a sense of what those are going to be and my expectations for those. As I've said before, this exam is going to be open note, open book. You can work on it with your friends. But I would suggest that with this many multiple choice questions and a fair number of short answer questions, that you'll need to prepare for this exam as if it was not an open note, open book exam. If you're spending your time looking up answers, it's going to be difficult to meet that time limit. So just as a word of caution on that. And then similarly for the working with a friend, for the short answer questions, my expectation is that every student's answers should be their own. So I shouldn't see any short answer questions that are identical to somebody else's. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week. As I've shared before, there's no lecture next week, and we'll use that time to prepare for the exam. And so Tuesday's class, I'll have the study guide out for y'all. And I'm more than happy to have a review session if you guys think that would be helpful. But I'll follow your lead on that. And then for Case 1 grading, seemed a little infeasible for me to try and do the gradings of the cases and prepare a study guide for y'all. So the face-to-face class folks said they would prefer to have a study guide than have their cases returned to them. So I say don't expect any grades for the cases until spring break. All right, so for today's class, we're going to again review this concept of value capture, value creation. We're going to quickly review what we talked about in the last lecture on efficiency and quality as competitive strategies. And then we're going to switch over to some other functional level strategies to create competitive advantage. And we're going to focus on superior innovation, superior responsiveness to customers, and then I've added a section on superior corporate social performance. So this is not something that's in your textbook, but I think is relevant and potentially useful. So the creating products and services that are better for the environment and society. All right, so the creating, capture, and creating and capturing value. So we've talked about this before. That we can conceptualize what firms do as taking inputs, doing some work on those inputs, and creating some additional value with their work. So there's the total value of a product or service. The value that's created is whatever value of the product or service above and beyond the cost of producing that product or service. Now, the economic value that's created, that can be understood as having two parts. There's the value to consumers, and then there's the value that's captured to the firm, largely through profits. And the amount of profits that a firm gets is related to the price. So the higher the price, the more of the value that's created a firm is able to capture. The lower the price, the less of the value created that the firm can capture. If price is set at firm's costs, then the firm is unable to capture any value. If the price is set to the maximum consumer surplus, then the firm is able to capture all of the value that's being created. Now, we know that firms are unable to set prices at exactly the total value that customers have, because other competitive firms are going to come in and take they're willing to take less profit, and then customers will choose those alternatives rather than yours. So the price has to be set somewhere below, but if you set it all the way low to cost, there's no profits that a firm gains. So with this box in mind, we can think of three ways in which firms can increase profits. The first is increasing overall value created. The second is decreasing the cost of production. Or the third is increasing price. And there are a number of ways in which firms are able to do any one of these three things. They can have superior efficiency. They can have superior quality, which are the two ideas that we talked about in the last lecture, or they can have superior innovation or superior customer responsiveness, which is what we're going to talk about today. And any of those strategies allow firms to either increase total value creation, decrease the cost of production, or differentiate their product in order to be in a less competitive industry space, allowing them to set higher prices. So superior efficiency, as we talked about in the last lecture, it can be understood as measured by the quantity of inputs that it takes to produce a given output. So it's that mathematically, its efficiency equals outputs divided by inputs. So the greater your outputs, holding inputs constant, the greater your efficiency. The lower your inputs, holding outputs constant, the greater your efficiency. And typically, when we think about ideal efficiency, it's when you're creating more with less. So you're increasing outputs and decreasing inputs at the same time. And some of the ways in which firms can do that include economies of scale, learning effects, experience curves, which are the combination of economies of scale and learning effects, which provide an incentive or a logical argument for increasing market share. And then also the flexible production and mass customization. So we talked about ways in which firms can continue to take advantages of economies of scale and learning effects, while also continuing to provide customers with unique and customized products. And then we talked about a number of different ways in which functional areas can both serve as a means and of areas of superior efficiency. So we talked about different strategies, HR strategies that can improve efficiency, but we also talked about ways in which HR and marketing and logistics and supply chain can be more efficient. We also, last lecture, talked about superior quality. And we understood quality that allows firms to increase profits by improving reputation, lowering costs, and we talked about a number of ways in which a better reputation improves or leads to lower costs. Particularly, some of the interesting ones were the non-market strategies in which reputation affects lowering costs. We also talked about quality as increasing the value created and reducing defects and errors in production, thus reducing waste, leading to more efficiency and increased or decreased costs. And we talked about the two ways in which you can view quality. You can view quality as reliability. So the idea of the DuPont drill compared to the Black & Decker drill. The DuPont drill is more likely to perform the function as specified because it's produced with higher quality in mind. And then we also talked about quality as excellence. So this is quality is sort of the idea of luxury goods and how these two are different. So that's what we talked about in the last lecture. Now I want to switch over to talk a little bit about innovation. And the way that I understand innovation or define innovation is the process of bringing to market inventions. So let's break that simple definition down a little bit. What do I mean when I say bring to market? It's the identification, selection, development, and commercialization of a product or service. So there are many ways in which you can bring things to market, and it's not necessarily innovation. We could even talk about bringing a new product or service that may not necessarily be innovation. The key part of innovation is it's bringing to market inventions. And inventions are, and there's a lot of debate about what constitutes an invention. But the way I think about it is products, services, or knowledge that previously did not exist in its current form. And so this can include, for example, new touchscreen computer tablets as an example of a product and invention. But it can also include services. So the internet streaming of Hollywood films is a service that before Netflix largely didn't exist. And it can also include knowledge. So cryptocurrency is an example of a knowledge. It's not really a service, it's not really a product. Cryptocurrency is more of an understanding. And so when we think about the innovation of cryptocurrency, it's not just the invention of cryptocurrency that matters, but it's thinking about how cryptocurrency can be commercialized. So how is it brought to market? And so we can again understand that the process of bringing new inventions to market includes identifying the new inventions that are relevant, selecting those that are most likely to succeed, and then developing and commercializing those products in such a way as to sell them to potential customers. So there's kind of two parts to innovation. There's the new part, but then there's also the bringing that new thing, service, or idea to market that matters. Now, having superior innovation allows firms to create more value. They're solving new customer problems or solving existing problems in better ways. It can also help firms reduce cost. So solving customer problems in new ways that are vastly less costly to do so. Thinking about new ways of new formats of video that allow for more efficient streaming is a way of reducing costs that doesn't really affect the customer only in so much as it reduces the cost to the customer or to the firm. Similarly, producing existing products or services in new ways. So that's a kind of innovation that can reduce costs. But innovation also allows firms to increase prices, and the way innovation allows firms to increase prices is it differentiates their products or services by integrating new technologies customers don't have. And so what you're able to do is you're able to kind of create a new space for yourself in the industry that is less competitive, thus allowing you to have higher prices. Now, we talked a little bit about this when we talked about research and development, but there are different kinds of innovations, and I would argue that in our society we've kind of become enamored with the Silicon Valley high-tech innovation, but that's only one kind of innovation that exists, and it's actually the kind of innovation that occurs the least frequently. And so, when you're thinking about your own firm and you're thinking about your own business and thinking about ways to innovate, I would encourage you to kind of expand your thinking about what that might mean. And so we'll go through some of these here now. So the first way of thinking about innovation is breakthrough versus incremental. And I touched on this briefly again when I was talking about the difference between basic and applied research. But breakthrough innovations are understood as dramatic, disruptive, and lead to significant changes in the market. And the kind of prototypical example of that are transistors, and the transistor technology allowed for the amplification of audio, which was necessary in order for radios to exist. And so once the transistor was invented, we saw this radical shift in the market for entertainment. All of a sudden, entertainment moved away from the stage and onto the radio, and so the transistor clearly, caused massive changes in the industry. And this is compared to incremental innovations, and these are typically understood as improvements upon existing products, services, or knowledge. So, kind of the incremental innovations are often, a better chainsaw. So, the general idea of the chainsaw is there, but maybe you have a new way or a new design for the blade that allows for better cutting. The innovation, it adds to an existing understanding or existing approach, whereas the breakthrough innovation is kind of the dramatic change that occurs. And what's interesting is we tend to focus a lot on breakthrough disruptive innovations. And there's reasons for that. The outcomes of the disruptive innovations can be quite large, but it's far less common than incremental innovations. And I would argue that even most of what we consider breakthrough innovation or disruptive innovation is in fact an extreme case of incremental innovation. That rarely is there a product or service that emerges that radically changes our understanding. And there's a lot of reasons why we might imagine that to be the case. And I think one of the most important ones, and this is in part one of the interesting things that Apple was able to overcome, is that oftentimes with disruptive innovations, consumers have a difficult time understanding how this new innovative product fits in their existing understanding. So, one of the things that was really interesting about Steve Jobs is that he was able to show people how to use these potentially disruptive technologies in their daily lives. And so again, the iPad was not a new idea. There were other tablet computers that existed before them, but Steve Jobs was really the first that was able to show consumers how they might use this product to make their lives better. There's also a difference between opportunity and need. So typically, when we think about opportunity-driven innovation, it's when an entrepreneur sees an opportunity and then develops the resources to take advantage of that opportunity. And so we call this being demand-driven. Alternatively, there is need innovation, and this is often conceptualized as understanding entrepreneurs have a certain set of resources, capabilities at their disposal, and they try and think about ways in which they might commercialize those resources, that knowledge into a new product or service. And so it's supply-driven in so much it's the entrepreneur thinking about what they have and how they might transform what they have into something that they could sell. Now again, these are ideal types, and so if we look at any individual or any real innovation, we'll see that it's a mixture of each of these. That no innovation is purely demand driven and no innovation is purely supply driven, but that it's some mix of the two. But it's important to distinguish these two because we can think about different strategies or different ways in which these might develop and how you might take advantage of them. And then similarly, we can think about innovation as technological versus social. And I talked a little bit about this when I talked about Apple, that the innovation that Steve Jobs really was able to bring to bear was largely social and less technological. And what I would argue is that most successful examples of innovation that we see in the market are not necessarily new technologies, but are examples of legitimizing previously known technologies. So, overcoming that social barrier that exists. And there's actually a whole area of research now devoted to trying to understand how entrepreneurs legitimize their new inventions. The strategies that they use to not only come up with new ideas, new inventions, but how do they convince other people that their new idea is something worthwhile. And finally, when we think about innovation, we can think about new versus novel. And so new technologies are technologies that didn't exist before, whereas novel technologies we might conceptualize as a reconfiguration of existing technologies in new ways. And so, one of my favorite examples of this are the farm-to-table restaurants. That farm-to-table restaurants, there's really not much new technology that's going on, but what they're doing is they're reconfiguring the relationship between the customer eating at the restaurant and the farm. It's rethinking through the supply chains and how food goes from being grown in the ground to being consumed. And so it's a new arrangement of relationships rather than new kinds of relationships being formed. So I'm a particular big fan of novel innovations as opposed to new innovations because I think there's a lot of value in heritage and tradition. If we can think about new ways in which heritage and tradition and culture can be configured for the new marketplace, I think there's a great deal of opportunity in that area. But there is a very high rate of failure for innovation, and some of the reasons why the demand for innovations are essentially uncertain. As we talked about, if this is a new product or service, it can be difficult to understand or know how consumers are going to respond to it. And so that makes it difficult to develop something, absent any feedback that's going to be successful. Similarly, the technology is poorly commercialized. That there may be this really fascinating and innovative new technology, but how you make money doing it, or how you make this a sellable product or good, can be really difficult. And we saw that early on with a lot of the initial social media platforms, and to this day it's a kind of an unanswered question. Is that you can have these great social media platforms, but how do you make money with them remains a bit unanswered. So while some social media platforms like Facebook have found a strategy that works, there are a number that continue to remain largely unprofitable. So one of the largest is Reddit, that continues to really struggle to find out how do they commercialize this online social media platform. There's also the poor positioning strategy, and positioning strategy are the sets of options for a product based on price, distribution, promotion, advertising, and product features. So often what we can see happen with new innovations is that you're trying to sell that innovation to the wrong customer, and that there's another customer group that would be more interested. or you're selling at a price that doesn't make sense. Um, and so we've kind of seen this play out. And what's interesting that happens is when a firm tries to commercialize a new product or service, and they've failed in their positioning strategy, what we often see is very quickly a competitor or another firm sees the right market position, and so they adopt the technology, and that they are able to successfully commercialize it. And then there's the marketing for a technology in which there's inadequate demand, and it's difficult to give examples of this because we don't hear about the innovation failures. We hear about the innovation successes, and so the innovations that are successful, we know that there was a demand for. But there are some examples of technology in which there was no demand. The PDA, the little handheld, the precursor to the tablet computer. There really wasn't much interest in it, and part of that is that technology wasn't really something that people wanted. So and the final cause for innovation failure are the slow marketing of products. So you've got this new innovation, this new technology, you develop products and services around it, but the gap between when that product is out there and when customers learn about it is too large, and firms aren't able to essentially reinvest in the technology to allow it to grow. So some of the strategies to overcome these innovative failures, one of the biggest ones, particularly when we're thinking about incremental innovations or innovations in a specific firm, is the tight cross-functional integration. Making sure that product development projects are driven by customer needs, that new products are designed for ease of manufacturing, that development costs are reduced, the time that it takes to develop a product and bring it to market is minimized, and that there's a close integration between research and development and marketing, so that you're launching, not only are you launching products that there's a known demand for, but you have a strategy in which you're going to communicate the availability of this new technology to potential customers. And so if you wait until the product is fully developed in order to begin your marketing campaign, it's going to be, you're going to have that period of time when you've got the technology available, but before consumers know what this technology is, how to use it, where they can buy it. And that's time in which a competitor can steal that technology, or time that you're not able to capture any profits to reinvest in the development of the product. So switching over to superior customer responsiveness, and customer responsiveness is really about giving customers what they want, when they want it, at a price that they're willing to pay. And customer responsiveness, it builds on differentiation, it adds to reputation and loyalty, and it can be a key factor in highly competitive industries. So one of the things that's really interesting to notice is the more monopolistic an industry is, the less likely customer service is going to be a factor in their product offerings. And the more fractured, the more competitive an industry is, the more likely that customer responsiveness is likely to play a big role. And we can think about this, using the example of the hospitality industry. So in towns where there's only one hotel, it's not likely that there's going to be very good customer service, because the hotel knows if you don't like the customer service, there's nowhere else to go. This is in contrast to towns in which there are a lot of hotels, a lot of options, and you'll see a much, much higher level of customer responsiveness when there's lots of options and a high level of competition. Even at budget hotels, you'll see higher levels of customer responsiveness, in large part because this is a key way in which firms can differentiate themselves in competitive industries or add value in competitive industries. And I'd also argue that customer responsiveness is at the core of building value. That one of the things that I think is interesting is firms that are willing to reduce customer service while holding price constant. What they're doing is they're affecting capturing value, because the total value that's created is decreased. And so if you reduce customer service or customer responsiveness, what you're doing is yes, you're lowering costs, but you're not keeping the total value created the same. And so the difference that occurs is an increase in profits, but a decrease in value creation. And thus, I would argue that firms that pursue this strategy, that they very quickly reach that point where their price and total customer value get close to each other. And so, even though a firm may have a lower price than a competitor, customers might switch to a higher priced option because of the customer service. And then another interesting thing is customer responsiveness also affects efficiency by addressing the quality before it becomes an issue. So if there's a problem with a product or service, oftentimes it's your customers that will identify some problems that exist. And so having customer service responsiveness is a way of seeing when there's a problem that's occurring. So maybe you got a bad batch of one of the raw materials you use. It wasn't noticed during the production, and it's only when customers start using it that you notice that raw material had some problems with it. And so you can, before you buy more of that raw material again, if you've got good customer responsiveness, you'll notice that there's something going on with that raw material, and you need to make a switch. So, and that can reduce costs. So, a lot of interesting ways in which customer responsiveness can benefit a firm. Now, in order to achieve customer responsiveness, you have to know who your customers are. You have to know what their wants are. And you have to have some means of acting on their knowledge. And this requires that there's leadership that demonstrates customer responsiveness, shaping employees' attitudes towards customers so that employees understand the importance of a customer, are willing to listen to customers, and that they see customers as a key part of the business success. And then also institutionalizing means of internalizing customer response. So there has to be some way in which, if a customer has a complaint or a customer expresses a desire for something different, a new feature, that there's some way for that information to get back into the firm to be integrated into future decision making. And so that it's not just about the front desk manager at the hotel listening to that employee, listening to that guest's criticism, but that front desk employee has a way of communicating that information so that it can be integrated for future decision making. Now, when we talk about satisfying customer needs, there's a few kind of generic ways in which we can think about responding to customers. So one is this customization, so varying the features of a good or service to tailor it to the unique needs or tastes of customers or groups, and in extreme cases to the individual consumer. So is there a way to make every hotel guest feel like they're having a unique experience? And Again, we've seen some very interesting ways in the hospitality industry in which that's being achieved. And then there's also response. So there's customization, but there's response, and that's the recognizing, valuing, and acting on customer demands. I think one way of thinking about response, automated customer support can achieve two different goals, or it can be instituted to achieve two different goals. And these are not necessarily mutually exclusive from each other, but I think how you think about implementing it has a dramatic effect on both what is done and the outcome for potential customers. So, if you see automated customer support as a means of improving response time and accuracy of support, that's likely to lead to higher levels of customer responsiveness. By contrast, if you see automated customer support as a means of reducing costs, then that's likely to lead to dissatisfied customers. The interesting thing is that you can implement an automated customer support with the intention of improving customer response time and accuracy of support in a way that reduces costs. But you're starting with the premise of you're trying to make a better customer experience. And that's going to lead to different outcomes than if you start with the premise of we want to cut costs. So how you conceptualize these strategies can have dramatic effects. And so the very same, on paper, the very same tactic, implementing an automated customer support service can have dramatically different effects based on how it's framed and how it's rolled out. Now, the interesting thing about corporate social performance, and so this is an area where I've spent a lot of my time thinking about and trying to understand and what this means. And there's an interesting perspective on corporate social performance. And it's this view that expands corporate social performance beyond financial or profit value, so beyond this kind of either or, the reason we exist is to make money, to consider how firms can generate profits that enhance or advances a social good. Now, this is not philanthropy or redistribution of wealth or advocating for greater regulation. It's really about firms utilizing their capabilities in order to advance social causes. And so this is, it's an alternative view than the zero-sum game of society versus profits. What this view argues is that, society benefits from profitable firms. This is a reconceptualization of what it is that firms are supposed to do, and kind of views profits as an outcome of creating value, rather than viewing value as a means to profit. So it's a slight different, but I think it has important implications. And there's three kind of paths or three strategies that we can think about that can lead to superior corporate social performance. One is the reconceiving the products and markets by redefining productivity in the value chain and enabling local cluster development. So we'll go through each of these here now. Now the socially superior products, it changes the question from is there a demand for our product to is our product good for our customers? So this view argues that it's not just, you can't just stop at, will somebody buy this? But you have to extend the question of if somebody, purchases this product, are they going to benefit from that purchase? And this very much changes the question about who's responsible for the use of the product or service. What this question or this reorientation is advocating for is that it's firms' responsibility for how consumers use products. So, we can think of the extreme example. You can definitely sell, heroin. There's definitely people that want to buy heroin, but the buying and using of heroin has a negative effect on customers. And so, the kind of argument that we're making here is, it's not just about the product; it's who benefits from consuming the product. So again, this producing products and services not because there's a demand, but meeting that demand leaves stakeholders better off. And one way is more responsible products. But the other is also thinking about new or markets that are in need of products, and one area of which this has been considered is kind of the bottom of the pyramid. And the bottom of the pyramid is thinking about that 90% of all consumers are on the bottom income bracket, and as you go up in income, the number of consumers decreases. And traditionally, we have developed product and services higher up on the pyramid, leaving the the bottom of the pyramid, without the products and services that they might benefit from. And so, there's been some reorganization or rethinking about how we make and how we market and how we distribute and how we package products. So that consumers in emerging markets and underserved and disadvantaged markets have an opportunity to purchase those. So, for example, one of the kind of prototypical examples of this has been soap. That we tend to sell laundry detergent in boxes of 20. So it's you don't buy a single-use laundry detergent at the grocery store. But if you're in a low-income area, you may not have the money to buy enough laundry detergent to do 20 loads. You might not even know if you're going to be doing 20 loads because you don't know where you're going to be after your first load. So, the selling of single-use laundry detergent is an example of rethinking a product or service to sell to the low-income communities. And again, the summary is this new orientation of firms that look to better products and services. Now, in addition to making better products, we can also think about making products better. And this is this socially superior production. And the general idea here is waste as a resource. So anytime that there is inefficiencies or waste or anything that's thrown away, in the production of a product or service, that to think about that waste as a possible resource in another way. And this has kind of been a number of different organizations, environmental organizations, have developed this idea. One of the most advanced is a concept called cradle-to-cradle design. It's also part of the natural capitalism group and some of the work that they've done. But it's looking at creative places in order to eliminate waste. And so some examples of this, there used to be a Subaru plant in Indiana. I don't know if it's still there, but it was one of the first zero waste auto manufacturing plants in the country. And one of the interesting things that they did there is when they would paint the car, with the spray paint, they would collect all the excess paint, so whatever sprayed that didn't get on the car or dripped down. They would collect that and they would use that as they would condense it and use those for bricks, for different colored bricks for construction. And so you can imagine interesting colors of building materials based off of the paint of cars. There's also been some interesting work on natural fertilizers, looking at organic waste and ways that can be collected, processed, and then used as a fertilizer. And then we've got one of the kind of the best examples of this here at Appalachian State with something called cogeneration, or combined heat and power systems. And the idea is that when you produce electricity through steam turbines, You have excess heat that's produced in making the steam. And rather than letting that steam, go up a pipe and out into the atmosphere, that you collect that heated air and you use that for your heating, which is what we have here at Appalachian State. So again, it's this idea of something that used to be thrown away has potential use as a resource, as an input for another process. Now, one question that I have is it pro-social if it's just good business sense? So if you're conserving energy, is that really being pro-social? And I think part of it is it depends. The interesting thing is we know that consumers have less of an interest. Okay, sorry about that. So this question is pro-social if it's just good business sense. So energy conservation, as an example. The interesting thing is at least from the customer's perception, it really depends. So what we found is again in the hospitality industry, that if you have low flow shower heads and energy efficient lighting, that consumers really don't see that as a benefit. They don't see that as a pro-social benefit that they are willing to pay more for. But it does have serious effects on, your ability to save energy, to save costs. The superior, socially superior production, has some interesting ways in which it may affect a firm's profitability, it's important to be clear on what the benefit is going to be of implementing any sort of practice. The other question to ask with socially superior production is, if the return on an investment is negative, should you still do it? And one of the best examples of this is composting in restaurants. Despite the effort of a lot of individuals in order to think about how we can do composting at restaurants, it's still costly for restaurants to compost. And so there's this question of should firms, should restaurants invest in composting? Well, there's this interesting paradox, or this interesting problem that emerges, is that one of the reasons why composting, at least in North Carolina, is not profitable or is more costly is because there's so few restaurants that do compost. And if there were more restaurants in higher density areas that did compost, that you'd have more firms enter into the market, and that it would become a viable, at least cost-effective alternative. So there is some interesting questions. The other question is the time horizon in which to operate. So thinking about socially superior production as a means of reducing costs. Typically, what we see is most businesses think about the payback period versus the return on investment. That if you're going to do energy efficient lighting, they recognize that there's a higher upfront cost, but that you'll save energy over time. And so the question that they ask is, well, how many years of operation do I have to use this product before it starts saving me money? And this is a different kind of question than thinking about what is the return on investment. The payback period is about, better payback periods are shorter, shorter time periods in which you recoup your costs, but you may have lower returns on investment with higher, with investments that have shorter payback periods. The other thing that I'd argue, though, or the interesting thing that's occurring, is that a number of businesses have recognized this difference between payback period and return on investment, and they've taken advantage of this difference. So we've seen this for solar energy installation. Solar energy installation tends to have, tends to have a fairly long payback period. That these are expensive systems that take a long time to pay off the initial investment. And oftentimes for small businesses, these payback periods of 8 to 10 years can be too long for a small business to swallow. And so what have emerged are these kind of special financing institutions or organizations that what they do is they will actually purchase the solar energy system and sell the energy to the consumer at a reduced rate, which allows the renewable energy the company that now owns the renewable energy to take advantage of that return on investment, and the small business doesn't have to worry about the payback period. So what I would argue is when there are times in which the payback period is too long for business to make sense, but there's still a good return on investment, that there's some interesting and creative ways of solving those problems. And finally, the socially superior communities, and this approach is a little different in that the argument here is that firms begin to recognize that they can benefit by increasing local capacity. So this idea of training and equipping suppliers, or the idea of good places to live are good places to do business. And so this is kind of shifting the responsibility from government and society to making communities better places to the firms that operate in them. This envisions or reimagines firms and production centers as being socially embedded. So again, this good places to live are good places to do business. Happy, healthy customers are good customers, and also this question of how do you want to feel when you, as an employee of the company, go to the grocery store, and it turns this question of who pays the cost of local exploitation on its head. This is oftentimes when we see firms exploiting communities. Oftentimes these are instances of market failure, that they're externalities or public goods that firms are able to take advantage of. And what we see in these cases are examples of firms that are internalizing those externalities, or they're taking responsibility for their consumption of public goods. I think that this is an area in which there's a lot of opportunities. Particularly as more and more firms, what we're seeing is more and more companies in the U.S. are struggling to find good employees, and this is despite the fact that in many parts of the country we still have high rates of unemployment. And so there's an interesting question of do firms have a responsibility, or could they benefit from partnering and working with other organizations in order to help get the local labor ready for jobs in these new industries. Now there are some limitations of corporate social performance, and so it's not that it's the panacea and ideal situation, and if we just do these things everything will be perfect. There's still a lot of things or questions to ask, and one of them is the inherent tension between short and long-term value. That one of the aspects of social responsibility and sustainability in general is that it's a conceptualization that I'm going to give up a little bit today in order to have more tomorrow, and that's an inherent tension. There are ways in which you might minimize that tension. There are strategies in which you might creatively think of opportunities in which to reduce that tension, but it's an unavoidable reality that it's there. The other question is, should only social activities that firms engage in be those that with a demonstrable profit opportunities? So what can be difficult is there are instances in which something is the right thing to do, that this is going to help the company, but how this is going to help the company is difficult to measure. It's difficult to specifically identify, and so the question is, if you can't prove on paper that this is a good thing, should you avoid doing it? And I think that's a tough question. There's also the unintended consequences of what I have here calling, filling institutional voids, or some sort of social initiative, and kind of one of the poster child of this is Tom's Shoes giving shoes to those in need. So some of y'all may be familiar with the brand Tom's Shoes, and they had a policy in which if you bought a pair of Tom's shoes, Tom's would donate a pair of shoes to somebody in need. Well, what ended up happening is in the communities in which they were giving shoes away, there were, local shoemakers, and those shoemakers all of a sudden were not only out of a job, but the knowledge of shoemaking disappeared because there was no need to make shoes because Tom was giving shoes away. And so what actually happened is that communities became dependent on Tom's for shoes. And when Tom stopped giving the shoes away, the community was actually worse off than they were before Tom started giving the shoes away. So I have no doubt in my mind that the initial idea was well intended and they wanted to do good, but there are unintended consequences that can occur, and so it's important to think through what you're doing and think through what the consequences of what you're doing might be. Another question that I have is can you do good production of bad goods? Can you do environmentally responsible production of heroin? Is that an admirable goal? My gut tells me that's probably not something that is good. And so this kind of distinguishing between good products versus good production, I think that there has to be some reconciliation between those two. That if you're going to produce a product or service that's with the intent of that product or service being improving social welfare, that there all has to be some consideration about the means in which they were produced, and then you can't just produce bad things more responsibly and say that it's okay. The other question to ask is how deep into the value chain are firms responsible for? So, if we're talking about, greener production, obviously that means you probably should consider, how green or socially responsible your suppliers are. But then do you need to think about your suppliers' suppliers and your suppliers' suppliers' suppliers? And, how far up the value chain do you have to be aware of? And we've seen this play out in a number of interesting ways recently with the sustainably harvested seafood. That restaurants want to they want to be more environmentally responsible, so they make an effort to purchase from environmentally responsible seafood from distributors that claim to sell environmentally responsible seafood, and those distributors buy from distributors who buy from distributors who buy from fishermen. And what some investigative reporting has found is that at some point in that value chain, somebody was lying. Somebody was saying this was environmentally responsible seafood, and it turns out that it wasn't. And so it's not clear if it was an individual actor, if it was the accumulation of small changes, but there was some problem. And the question is, who's responsible for that? Is it the restaurant at the end of the chain? So that's a question to ask. And then the other question to ask is the conflicting and ulterior motives of different actors. So we talked about Tom's Shoes, that a bad outcome occurs from a good intent. Well, what happens when a good outcome occurs from a bad intent? And one of the best examples of this is, the soda, bottling companies and their promotion of recycling. So it's very interesting that if you go to any county fair or football game or sporting event and you see recycling containers, it's very, very common that you'll see that those recycling containers are sponsored or given by Coca-Cola or Pepsi. And one of the interesting reasons for this is that Coca-Cola and Pepsi, one of their big fears is that government is going to make them responsible for the bottles and empty cans once the soda's been consumed. And they don't want that. That's a logistical nightmare for them. It raises costs, and they are very happy with cities and municipalities being responsible for the collecting and managing of those empty bottles. And so one way in which they can ensure that that happens is by making recycling not only something that's easy to do, but something that becomes part of our expectations. Because if there's recycling programs, then there has to be some feed source for those recycling programs to be effective, and that takes off any pressure from the bottling companies to be responsible for the bottles and cans that they make. So you have this interesting situation in which you have companies that don't want to be responsible for their actions, and so what they do is they make recycling socially a social norm, and there's this question of is that a good thing? Interesting questions to think about. So now, just as a recap here of today, we've talked about increasing value capture. We've talked about the role of functional areas in competitive advantage, specifically innovation. We've talked about different types of innovation and causes of innovation failure and ways to reduce the failure of innovation. We've talked about customer responsiveness, this idea of focusing and satisfying customers and ways in which you do that. And then we wrapped up talking about corporate social responsibility. So for next class, as I said, there's going to be no lectures next week. It'll be preparing for the exam. The quiz is due this Friday. And I hope you guys have started, at least, or will start very soon, thinking about how to prepare for your exam. So thank you all very much. And as always, if there are any questions or comments, please feel free to post questions to the student question lobby. I would ask that we not use the student question lobby as a platform to complain or criticize. And if I see those kinds of comments, I'm going to delete those. But it is a place, if you have questions or comments that you think would be helpful to share, that's a great place to do it. Or if you're not comfortable doing that, please feel free to contact me. All righty, thank you all very much.